Hi. So this will be the second of our two-part lecture on the labor movement in the United States, looking at both past and present examples. And this is sort of part of a larger series of lectures about social movements and forms of resistance to social inequality. So I'm going to go to the screen share and pull up our PowerPoint. We're going to kind of start with like a sort of a long-term look at a decline in the number of strikes and work stoppages in American history. And then note that in the past few years, there have been these signs of a kind of a resurgence of labor. And so we'll look at some examples from that. The Red for Ed strikes, in the education sector in 2018 and 2019, the organizing at Starbucks and Amazon that I talked about in the first lecture, that I'll just kind of briefly recap again. And then the growth of work stoppages in the last year or two, with the University of California academic strike, the Hollywood writers and actors strike, and then the United Auto Workers strike. All these as, again, examples of that we can suggest that perhaps labor is making a resurgence after many decades of declining strength. In the historical part of the lecture, like the sort of the second half, we'll turn to looking at general strikes and sit-down strikes. And as with the first lecture, I'm not able to cover every single instance, but I will touch on some of the real major touchstones for labor history in this country. And so we'll look at the general strikes in Seattle and San Francisco, and finally in Oakland. And then we'll be looking at sit-down strikes, the most famous of which is the Flint sit-down strike that created the United Auto Workers. Okay, so the data here that comes from Doug Henwood sort of has mapped the long-term decline in the number of strikes and lockouts, in other words, of work stoppages over the decades going back to 1950. And you see both here in terms of the share of workers involved, and like the percentage of workers involved in a strike or lockout on the left-hand graph, or the number of strikes and lockouts involving 1,000 more workers. In both instances, the cases of the data point to a long-term decline in strike activity. You can see that in the 1950s, there's it's not even, but there is a kind of the beginning of this kind of decline. Through the mid 1960s, we do see an increase again in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but then going into the 1970s, a real drop off. And then, in 1980, as we have mentioned in previous lectures, when Ronald Reagan's first act or one of his first acts as president of the United States is to fire the air traffic controllers who have gone out on strike, it sends a real chilling effect throughout the labor movement. And so we see a real precipitous drop off into the 1980s. And that has continued, even with the recent increases in more visible strikes and union organizing that we'll talk about in the lecture. Even with that, the the percentage of people and the number of strikes that are taking place in America is just a small fraction of what it used to be. And this is, a kind of measure of the increasing weakness of organized labor, which we talked about in the first lecture. Somebody in our union, for example, the California Faculty Association, the union that I'm part of, says that like a union that doesn't go on strike is like, having a gym membership and never going to the gym. It's like you have that, you have that membership, but like just because you have the membership doesn't guarantee that you're going to get stronger. In fact, if you don't go to the gym, you're just going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. And this is sort of what has happened with organized labor in since the middle of the 20th century, is that with the strike is kind of like the most effective tool, the most effective weapon that organized labor has to get its in collective bargaining to get its demands met. And as that has been less and less employed as a tactic, the strike has been less and less employed as a tactic. It's meant that the working class and the middle class have gotten weaker. And as we've seen in many lectures throughout the course here, beginning in the 1970s and 80s, we see wages stagnating, the working class getting weaker, and the capitalist class taking home more and more profits and a bigger share of the income and wealth in the society in general. So that's sort of the bad news. The good news, at least from the perspective of labor, is the signs of organizing and increasing militancy and increasing willingness to go on strike that we've seen in the last 5 years or so. And one real turning point was the Red for Ed campaign among educators in so-called red states, so-called like states that are predominantly Republican and therefore, have less state funding for education, and education in general is less of a priority in these red states. But beginning in February of 2018, a strike by teachers and support staff shut down schools in all 55 counties of West Virginia, and this kicked off the sort of what became the Red for Ed campaign. Their strike then inspired educators across the country and raised hopes for a widespread revival of organized labor. Later that year, school employees went on strike in Oklahoma and Arizona, and there were walkouts in Kentucky, North Carolina, and Colorado to demand increased education funding and better pay. So again, this takes on a kind of a political thing, because the more sort of Republican dominated a state is, the less money there tends to be at the state level for education funding. So these are teachers that are walking out, and striking, not just for their own personal incomes, but also to try to make a larger political demand for increased state funding for education. So this movement became known as the Red for Ed movement, because these actions erupted in these Republican-dominated states, these red states that have weaker labor unions, that have more likely to have right-to-work laws that we talked about in the previous lecture, to have bans on public sector strikes, and above all, electorates that vote for Republican candidates and that voted for Donald Trump. So all of this was sort of unexpected and raised some hopes for a revival of organized labor. That Red for Ed movement then spread nationwide in 2019, with strikes throughout 2019 in cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, Chicago, and Denver, more sort of democratic cities and states. In the last lecture, we mentioned also the sort of resurgence of labor as evident in the organizing in Starbucks and Amazon. So I'll just kind of briefly mention that here and move on, since I talked about it in the previous lecture as well. So, in April of 2022, a majority of the workforce at a warehouse in Staten Island, New York, voted to join the Amazon labor union, even though Amazon had spent $4.3 million on union busting consultants, as was referenced in the previous lecture. Likewise, since 2021, more than 8,000 workers at approximately 360 Starbucks stores in 40 states across the country have voted to unionize. So here, we're talking about workers, organizing and being more willing to choose union representation. So when we look at just the last year or two, we have seen a significant increase in the amount of work stoppages and the number of workers going out on strike. In 2022, there was a 52% increase in the number of work stoppages from the previous year, with 60% more workers participating in such work stoppages. And so what that means, how that translates numerically, is the number of work stoppages in 2021 grew from 272 in 2021 to 424 in 2022. And the number of workers taking part in those work stoppages increased from 140,000 to 224,000. So that is a significant increase. But again, to frame it in the long view of history, just to give you a point of comparison, in 1946, there were 4.6 million workers that went out on strike, accounting for something like 28 million days, strike days. And so when we look at these numbers in 2022, it's just a small fraction, 5% or maybe 10% of the number of strike days that of what it used to be when labor was at its strongest point after World War II. The western region of the United States saw the largest increases in work stoppages, and we'll be talking about those in the next couple of slides. The education sector was the one that accounted for the greatest number of striking workers and strike days, as you see in the pie charts on the left-hand side. The majority of workers and the majority of strike days involve the educational sector. But certainly that was not the only one. The most number of work stoppages, as we see at the top pie chart, was actually in accommodation and food services. So whether that's like fast food or hotels, or those kinds of services. Strikes were also very frequent in healthcare and social assistance. As we've seen, for example, with like Kaiser, nurses or psychologists. Those folks going out on strike. Also in manufacturing and in information services. So this, education kind of had a sort of leading role in this, but this is relatively widespread across a number of different sectors of the workforce. The main demand, as you see on in the chart on the right side, has been for increased pay Overall, that's been the main demand, but you notice that it's by no means the only one. Also, very important on the minds of workers has been health and safety. Especially around like COVID protocols and things of that matter, staffing, healthcare, and also an end to anti-union retaliation, as we have seen in talking about Starbucks workers, who have taken action against these illegal firings of Starbucks workers who are trying to organize their stores. So that is something, again, that suggests that we may be at the beginning of a new resurgence of organized labor. How long that happens, or to how much that increases, is anybody's guess at this point. So when we mentioned in the previous slides that education, the educational sector has had a leading role in this resurgence of organized labor, and especially in the West Coast. So the University of California academic workers strike turns out to be the largest academic strike in American history. In November 2022, some 48,000 academic workers at all campuses of the University of California system, including the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, went on strike for better pay and better benefits. The UC academic workers strike was the largest strike in the United States in 2022, and the largest strike in the history of US higher education. And it was a success. The strike ended with workers securing significant gains in pay, as well as paid parental leave and childcare subsidies. In more recent months, we've seen the Hollywood writers and actors going out on strike. So from May to September 2023, the Writers Guild of America, the WGA, representing about 11,500 screenwriters, went on strike for 148 days. It was the longest interruption to American film and television production since the COVID-19 pandemic. And a focal point in the labor dispute was the residuals from streaming media, which the WGA claims has cut much of the writers' average incomes compared to a decade ago. Writers also wanted artificial intelligence, such as ChatGPT, to be used only as a tool that can help with research or facilitate script ideas, and not as a tool to replace them. So here's actually, these two issues are ones where the actors and the writers have found common cause with the sort of transition to a more kind of streaming based media, as opposed to the older system of television and the cable and network TV. It's basically been things have been reconfigured such that writers and actors have seen the residuals, the money that they make from their programs being streamed, has been in steady decline. And they're really concerned looking forward with this second issue about artificial intelligence and the way that ChatGPT might be used to replace writers, and even the way in which artificial intelligence might be used to replace like the likeness of actors, the look and likeness of them. So they have kind of found common cause. And so what we've seen with the American Actors Union, the SAG, AFTRA, the Screen Actors Guild, and American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. They are still on strike and have been since July, at least, as I am recording this here in early November. The strike is the first one that has been initiated by actors in the US since 1980, and the first time that actors and writers have walked out simultaneously since 1960. And again, we have these two issues. With the rise of streaming during the last decade, writers and actors have been frustrated over studio policy regarding residuals from streaming services. And as with striking WGA writers, actors have expressed concerns about the use of artificial intelligence, noting that it could be used to replicate their likeness without compensation. So there's an attempt to kind of get ahead of these new technologies, and to sort of catch up to the impact that streaming has had in the last 10 or 15 years, and also to get ahead of this issue of artificial intelligence and the way that it could potentially replace human labor. As we've seen with so many labor disputes and conflicts, a lot of times they center around the way in which technology of one sort or another is being used to replace human labor. And then finally, we've seen since September, the United Auto Workers strike. The United Auto Workers went out on strike on September 15th, 2023, against the three unionized automakers in the United States. That is the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Stellantis. It is the first trilateral strike against the three automakers in the union's history. Together, these three automakers' factories employ about 145,000 UAW members combined. They produce about 50% of the vehicles manufactured annually in the United States. As of just a couple of days ago, November 1st, 2023, the UAW had secured a tentative agreement with all three of the automakers, including apparent wins on everything from pay to the two-tiered system to reopening an idled plant. The deals will go to the membership for a ratification vote. So that's kind of the stages of how these things take place. Is that leadership bargains and reaches a tentative agreement with management and the company, but then it's up to the workers themselves, the membership, to vote yay or nay on whether they want to accept that tentative agreement. And so if they feel like, for example, that the tentative agreement isn't strong enough, they can reject that and continue to be on strike. So that's sort of the what's going on or has been going on recently. And as we did with the last lecture, I want to now kind of pull back into history and to see what kind of lessons can be learned from the history of the labor movement that was much stronger than it is today, back in this period roughly between the 19-teens and the 1940s. And we're going to be talking about historical instances of general strikes and sit-down strikes. And so a general strike is what we define as a stoppage of work by a substantial portion of workers in a number of industries. General strikes have often taken control over an entire city at one time. And so a strike that covers only one industry cannot be called a general strike. It has to be something that's coordinated across a number of different unions. And in the historical examples that we're looking at, um, it generally involves, workers from all sorts of industries who, if there's enough people that are engaged in a work stoppage, they can like shut down a whole city and take control of that city, as we'll see when we look at things that have happened in San Francisco and Oakland historically. So a general strike is kind of an escalation of tactics, and really it challenges not just like one particular workplace or one particular industry, but begins to really challenge the capitalist system as a whole. And so this is really the most powerful tool in the arsenal of the organized labor movement. And then we'll also be looking at sit-down strikes, which are also a kind of an escalation. The sit-down strike has been used by unions to occupy plants of companies that they were on strike against. And one major advantage of the sit-down strike is that it prevents employers from sending in replacement workers. So that's the dynamic that we've seen in the previous lecture historically, with things like the Homestead strike or the Pullman strike, where the basically the employers are able to bust the strike by hiring people that are known as scabs to come in and replace the striking workers. And so the response to that in the 1930s, in like 1936, 1937, was to literally like occupy the factory, to occupy the workplace so that they couldn't do that, so that the employers couldn't send in scabs and replacement workers. And so again, it's an escalation of tactics in which workers are not just withholding their labor, they are seizing the means of production. They're seizing the factory and the equipment, and they're engaged in a tactic of occupation and not just one of withholding labor. So there is an upsurge of strike activity that really follows the Russian Revolution in 1917, which has a whole kind of international impact, and the end of World War I, the following year of 1918. There's a big wave of labor militancy in many parts of the world, not just in the United States. And so in here in the U.S., the high point of that post World War I struggle was the Seattle General Strike of 1919, which was a 5-day general work stoppage by some 65,000 workers in February of 1919. And so again, like as a general strike, this involved workers in a number of different industries who came together and basically were able to shut down and control the city of Seattle for a number of days, until the mayor and the police basically came in and broke it up. The general strike began with shipyard workers in several unions who were locked out of their jobs when they tried to start to strike for higher wages. And in solidarity, many other local unions began to join their walkout, including members of the American Federation of Labor and the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, which I again referenced in the last lecture. The IWW being really the most radical wing of the labor movement, both in terms of their willingness to organize unskilled and immigrant labor, and in their willingness to take on more radical tactics like sabotage, or in this case, a general strike. The AFL, in contrast, represents a more kind of conservative wing of the labor movement, insofar as they were more inclined to just try to protect their membership, and often their membership were more skilled workers who were native born to the United States, who were not, immigrants. So the general strike, as we can kind of explore more here as a tactic, the general strike is an action in which participants seize all economic activity across various sectors to achieve a common social or political goal. They are organized by large coalitions of political, social, and labor organizations, and may also include rallies, marches, boycotts, civil disobedience, non-payment of taxes, and other forms of direct or indirect action. And so the intent of this is to really have a huge impact on the economy as a whole, by workers engaging in this kind of coordinated action across many different workplaces and industries. So, for example, in the Seattle general strike of 1919, a cooperative body made up of rank and file workers from all the striking locals were formed during the strike and called themselves the General Strike Committee. And it acted as a virtual counter government for the city. So it's like workers basically have taken over the governance and just the day-to-day operations of the city. The committee organized to provide essential services for the people of Seattle during the work stoppage. So they organized, garbage collection and health services and laundry and fire prevention. All these decisions were made like democratically by workers, in these unions, about what kind of services were essential. In general, work was not halted if doing so would endanger lives. So they basically kind of became the effective counter government in Seattle for 5 days. So this is why we say that general strikes are really a major step towards challenging capitalism as an economic system, not just challenging one particular company or one particular industry, but challenging the system as a whole. Before the Seattle general strike, there are many examples that we can point to, especially in Europe, and where this tactic had been employed in the 19th century. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great scholar, described the period during the Civil War, during the American Civil War, the 1860s, described the slave desertions and rebellions during the Civil War as a kind of general strike. That is to say that hundreds of thousands of slaves started fleeing the southern plantations, and many of them joined up with the Union Army of the North to fight against the Southern Confederacy, and kind of tipped the scales of the conflict. Something like 200,000 formerly enslaved Black people basically joined up with to fight on behalf of, or with the Union Army. And you have to remember, like in the Civil War, if you don't know that, like in the Civil War, that the South was winning initially, and they won the first few battles of the Civil War in 1861. But then when the Northern Army started sort of coming into the South, you have all these slaves that start to run away and flee the plantation. And again, many of them, join up with the Union Army. And so this has a kind of a twofold effect in that it, increases the strength of the North, and also cripples the economy of the South, because the South had been so dependent on this plantation slave labor. And so this is a big part of like why the North ends up winning the Civil War. Um, uh, some 12 years after the end of the Civil War, and we talked about in the previous lecture the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So in St. Louis, the general strike in St. Louis kind of evolves out of this Great Railroad Strike. As I, talked about in the previous lecture, the railroad strike in the summer of 1877 had started in West Virginia and then kind of spread across the country, along these in communities where the railroads were the biggest employers. St. Louis was one of those cities, and in St. Louis, things actually escalated into, beyond just like the railroads, into an actual general strike. And it was also very remarkable in the sense that it unified white and black workers, in this citywide general strike, and sort of overcame a lot of the racism that had been inculcated into white workers. And so these two groups were able to, come together and flex their economic muscles. And this culminated in a transfer of power within St. Louis that elites compared to the Paris Commune of 1871. In 1892, there was also a general strike in New Orleans, that united workers across racial lines. Again, despite appeals to race hatred that were especially strong in the South, of course, Black and white workers remained united. The unions established a central labor council that represented more than 30,000 workers. And these three racially integrated unions, the Teamsters, the Scalesmen, and the Packers, made up what came to be known as the Triple Alliance in the New Orleans General Strike of 1892. So those are some examples to kind of illustrate that this, Seattle was by no means the first city to see this kind of general strike, but that there were these kind of historical precedents going back into the 19th century. The 1930s is really the period where things intensify and accelerate, even much further. Union organizing and strike activity intensified during the 1930s in the context of the Great Depression. In March of 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt granted workers the right to organize into unions through Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act. And that section states that employees shall have the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their choosing, and shall be free from the interference, restraint, or coercion of employers. This was the first time that this had been encoded into federal law, that workers had a right to organize and to choose union representation. Now, this was just at the time in 1933, this was just a temporary measure. This National Industrial Recovery Act was part of a series of programs known as the New Deal, in which the Roosevelt administration was trying to deal with the economic impact of the Great Depression. So this would later be codified and made permanent in the National Labor Relations Act, that basically guarantees workers the right to choose union representation That would come a couple of years later, in a later part of the New Deal. So, but even still, in 1933, this is a big deal, even if it's temporary at the moment. In 1933, there were 1,695 work stoppages, and that represented twice as many as the year before, involving over 1 million workers. And that was, 4 times as many as the previous year. And again, much more than we see today, so by, a factor of many more times, of like 5. The numbers then increased again in 1934 when there were 1,856 strikes involving 1,470,000 workers. So, in response to the economic hard times of the Great Depression, workers are getting organized, they're becoming more militant, they're more willing to go out on strike. They are wanting to be represented by unions. There is this whole kind of social movement that is growing in response to the larger economic conditions of the Great Depression. And that brings us to San Francisco, with what started out as the West Coast waterfront strike, among basically longshoremen working on the docks in up and down the West Coast. The 1934 West Coast waterfront strike began on May 9th, when longshoremen in every West Coast port from Seattle to Los Angeles walked out. On July 5th, 1934, the police in San Francisco fired their guns into a crowd of these striking workers and killed 2 of them in an incident that came to be known and is still known as Bloody Thursday. So, as we saw in the previous lecture, whether it was talking about the Bread and Roses strike or the Homestead strike, when the police become violent against striking workers, it often has the effect of pouring gasoline onto a fire. And it has the effect of then mobilizing not just the workers themselves, but the entire community. It just fuels a sense of collective outrage. And that would happen in San Francisco because insofar as the killing of these striking workers escalates things from a waterfront strike into a general strike that shuts down, that paralyzes the city of San Francisco for a number of days. So, in response to these police killings, unions from across the Bay Area organized a general strike that paralyzes the city of San Francisco for 4 days. And non-union truck drivers joined the first day. The movie theaters and the nightclubs shut down. While food deliveries continued with the permission of the strike committee, many businesses closed, posting signs in support of the strikers. And so, essential services were allowed to continue, but otherwise, at this point, the workers really have control over the whole city. And things have, kind of escalated to that sense. And so you see here in the newspaper on the right-hand side, just what a condition of, almost like a warlike situation came to be here in the city of San Francisco in the summer of 1934. In response to that general strike, San Francisco's mayor declared a state of emergency. The California National Guard was called in, and along with local police, they arrested hundreds of labor activists and raided their local offices. So they just basically started rounding up some of the most prominent organizers and activists and throwing them in jail, and then going to the offices of all these unions and breaking stuff, and breaking in and breaking their stuff and breaking their equipment, and arresting people that they found there. But in the end, the general strike and the waterfront strike in general would be successful insofar as it led to the unionization of all the West Coast ports of the U.S. Big picture nationally, the San Francisco general strike of 1934, along with a strike in Toledo among the auto light strike, and the Minneapolis Teamsters strike of like truck drivers, led by the Communist League of America. All of these things that are happening around the summer of 1934 were kind of the catalysts for the rise of industrial unionism in the 1930s, much of which was organized through the Congress of Industrial Organization, otherwise known as the CIO. And later the CIO would merge with the AFL to become one union. But at this point in the 1930s, the CIO is more of a kind of a union that's representing more of the lower paid and lower skilled kind of workers, and is willing to engage in more kind of radical actions and tactics than what the AFL was doing. In response to this, basically the Roosevelt administration makes permanent what had been previously only conditional and temporary, which is the law that workers basically have a right to organize a union, and that is codified into law in the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which is also known as the Wagner Act, which finally guaranteed workers the rights to collective bargaining through unions of their own choice. And so this passage of the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, came in response to the increasing labor organizing and militancy during the 1930s. So something that was basically won by these workers, and through this these strikes and this general strike, and through this increasing popular demand. The act also established the National Labor Relations Board, which exists to this day, whose basically task is to facilitate wage agreements and to suppress the repeated labor disturbances. The NLRB basically operates as a kind of like a arbitration body between workers and management. The Wagner Act did not compel employers to reach agreement with their employees, but it opened possibilities for American labor. And the result was a tremendous growth of membership in the labor unions, especially in the mass production sector, led by the older and larger AFL and the new and more radical CIO. And then as the 1930s continue, and as labor continues to build momentum as a social movement, the sit-down strike begins to be employed as a kind of tactic. This was a new tactic that began to spread in the labor movement in 1936, the sit-down strike, in which workers not only withheld their labor, but occupied their workplace. And the effectiveness of the tactic is that it prevents employers from replacing them with strike breakers or removing equipment to transfer production to other locations. So, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, this is a kind of a reaction to the way that employers had, tried to break the strikes of the 1890s and teens, to sort of not just withhold their labor, but to occupy the workplace, to seize the means of production. The first instance where we see this being done is in 1936 with rubber workers in Akron, Ohio. The rubber, workers at the rubber production plants had struck 5 different companies over the course of several months in Akron. And then the workers at the largest factory basically occupied their workplace in a sit-down strike, as it describes here at the Firestone factory. But the most famous of the sit-down strikes, and the one that has had the most lasting impact, was the one in Flint, Michigan, among the auto workers. And as I said earlier, this really established the power of the United Auto Workers, who were, obviously behind the recent strike of auto workers, but have also, partnered with academic workers and were, led the academic strike at the University of California. So this was a real, this was a huge, momentous moment in the history of the labor movement that has lasting impacts to this day. So the 1936-1937 Flint sit-down strike occupied the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan. It was the most significant labor conflict in the 20th century. From December 28th, 1936 to February 11th, 1937, 140,000 GM workers either sat down or went on strike. And you see here in the picture of like what this often looked like was like these guys like basically like locked themselves in the factory and, would, sitting there like reading the paper and, just occupying things, so that like no cars are being built and there's no way to like bring in scabs to continue the production. So the sit-down strike made the United Auto Workers, the UAW, into a major labor union and led to the unionization of the domestic automobile industry. By the end of 1937, nearly 500,000 workers across the US had participated, had taken part in a sit-down strike. The overall number of strikes more than doubled from 2,172 in 1936 to 4,740 in 1937, involving nearly 2 million workers in total. So again, things are really increasing at an exponential rate here, where we're talking about, more than twice as many strikes from one year to the next. And so as the 1930s kind of goes on, the labor movement is building up a lot of momentum and strength. After World War II, we see another wave of militancy. So with the war, there had been a lot of agreements basically not to strike, and the idea was that a strike during a period of wartime mobilization could be unpatriotic insofar as it disrupted the war effort. But when the war was over, there was another wave of militancy that we see that was even greater than what we had seen in the late 1930s. Across the US, workers had suffered major losses, job losses, and wage reductions in the year following the end of the war. A quarter of war workers had lost their jobs by the winter of 1945-46, and real incomes had declined by 15% between July and October of 1946. And workers who had made great sacrifices during wartime were now facing the specter of a second Great Depression. So, as is commonly known, it was World War II that, once and for all kind of lifted the United States out of its Great Depression. And with the end of that war, we start to see these kind of job losses and these wage cuts, and workers, are starting to be afraid that there's just going to be a lapse into a second Great Depression, now that intense wartime mobilization had ended. And so we see another wave of militancy, and really the centerpiece of that is in Oakland, the Oakland General Strike of 1946, in which more than 130,000 workers shut down and controlled the entire city for 54 hours in the largest general strike in U.S. history in terms of the number of workers involved here. The general strike in this case was not planned, but it was rather something that spread spontaneously and organically among the city's working class. The Oakland General Strike began with the Department Store and Specialty Clerks Union Local 1265. These were mostly working women, working in like department stores, department clerks, that kind of like, service work jobs. And they had been picketing outside of the Conn's and Hastings stores in Latham Square, where Broadway and Telegraph come together in downtown Oakland. And the picketing had been going on for about a month at that point. The employers were not bargaining with them. And so they've been on strike for about a month. And then one morning, Monday, December 2nd, all of a sudden these trucks with non-union drivers arrive with deliveries of goods that were to be sold in these department stores downtown. And so the strikers responded by blocking the entrance to the store, to Hastings. And then the Oakland police responded to that by dispatching 250 officers and 12 squad cars to escort the trucks through the picket lines. And as people are all seeing this on the morning of December 2nd, people are on their way to work, and they witness the city's police protecting these strike-breaking truckers, and they begin to pour into the downtown area to take action to try to stop this. So there's, again, this wave of solidarity that engulfs working people throughout the whole city of Oakland. They begin to identify and express solidarity with these department store clerks who had been on strike, and again, especially like the way in which like the police were used to protect like the strike breakers is an especially like odious act by the Oakland police at this time that really mobilizes the working people across the city to want to sort of take action. And so that's how this kind of thing escalates into a general strike where you have 130,000 workers across the city that basically shut down Oakland for 2 days. And, in properly Oakland style, it wasn't just a strike, but it turned into kind of like a party, like a festive environment of resistance, filled with music and dancing spread through the streets of Oakland overnight. More than 100,000 workers had joined the general strike in less than 24 hours. So there's this kind of like wave of excitement in the streets in downtown Oakland. And one participant described this atmosphere. He said, by nightfall, the strikers had instructed all stores except pharmacies and food markets to shut down. Bars were allowed to stay open, but they could only serve beer and had to put their jukeboxes on the sidewalk to play at full volume and at no charge. They played the song Pistol Packin' Mama, Lay That Pistol Down, the number one hit, echoed off all the buildings. That first 24-hour period of the 54-hour strike had a carnival spirit. A mass of couples danced in the streets. The participants were making history, knew it, and were having fun. By Tuesday morning, they had cordoned off the central city and were directing traffic. Anybody could leave, but only those with passports, i.e., union cards, could get in. Never before or since had Oakland been so alive and happy for the majority of the population. It was a town. It was a town of law and order. In that city of over 250,000, strangers passed each other on the street and did not have fear, but the opposite. So again, you see this in a number of general strikes in which workers occupy the city. That there's also this kind of joyous element to it, in which people are like creating, the model of a new kind of society. They're sort of like experimenting with like what is possible, and they're kind of seeing that like a new world, a new kind of system, could be in the making. That it didn't have to be the way that it was. It didn't have to be this system of capitalist exploitation in which workers are disempowered and disenfranchised. And so in that coming together, there's not only like rage and protest and anger, there's also this sense of joy and festivity and, the sense of like that another world is possible. The Oakland strike was by far was part of the largest strike wave in American history in 1946. By the year's end, 4.6 million workers had gone on strike, costing employers a total of 28.5 million workdays. So again, compare that to last year, 2022, when we had 224,000 workers on strike. That's about 5% of 4.6 million. So just as a point of comparison, and that increase in 2022 was a substantial increase from the year before, but that substantial increase was nowhere near what it was at the end of World War II. And so this is the point where workers are really at their strongest, and working people would really reap the benefits of that strength in the decades that followed. As we've seen in multiple lectures, and I pointed out to you statistically in all sorts of ways, the way in which like working class and middle class people on the whole really prospered and shared in rising wages and a better standard of living in the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s. And that has everything to do with the strength and power of organized labor, as it had been gathering momentum, through the 1930s and into the post-war era. Along with Oakland, there were general strikes in Rochester, New York, Stamford, Connecticut, and Lancaster and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Some 400,000 coal miners and 750,000 steelworkers went on strike. Just unbelievable numbers. Work stoppages among auto workers closed 80 General Motors plants in 50 cities. And so this is, again, like, organized labor really at its strongest point, and they would really kind of reap the benefits of that in the decades to come. But it did come with a kind of a reaction then on the part of the ruling class by way of the state. And that comes in what's known as the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. So here, the US Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act in the aftermath of this 1946 strike wave. And what it did was it outlawed actions taken by unionized workers in support of workers at other companies, effectively rendering both solidarity actions and the general strike itself illegal. The act made it illegal for one union to go on strike in support of another. It outlawed wildcat strikes, solidarity strikes, secondary boycotts, and mass picketing. Taft-Hartley also required all union officials to sign affidavits stating that they were not members of the Communist Party and had no relationship to any organization seeking the overthrow of the United States government. So in this sense, Taft-Hartley is kind of the beginning of what came to be known as McCarthyism, of the second Red Scare of the late 40s and early 1950s, in which there's this massive purge of people who had been associated with communism in the 1930s and 40s. There's a purge of them, especially from like Hollywood and from the labor unions, and it's an intentional act to try to basically strip away the most militant sectors of the unions. So Taft-Hartley in this way is really a reaction to try to lessen the power of organized labor, and it was very effective in doing so. After Taft-Hartley was passed, the number of strikes began to decline. They never approached the 1945-1946 level again. And by the end of the 1950s, the labor movement had entered its long-term decline, as we saw in one of the earlier slides. Thus, by definition, the definition and practice of a general strike changed in modern times to mean periodic days of mass action coordinated by unions, but not an official or prolonged strike. So it doesn't necessarily end the idea of a general strike, but it does put big legal constraints on that. We're going to be looking at general strikes again when we look at the more current events around the Occupy movement. And so that's kind of like where the next lecture in this series will be going, to be thinking about the Occupy movement of 2011 and 2012 and sort of where it came from and where it's gone since. So that'll be the topic of the next lecture. Until then, I bid you adieu, and I'll see you next time. Bye.